Welcome to the Cyber Tech Podcast, inside the minds of everyday IT and cyber pros, powered by AspireByte, hosted by Mike Fierros. Real life stories, real careers, real world experience. Each episode brings you honest conversations with people working across the tech field, from cybersecurity and information security to IT, sharing lessons learned, challenges faced, and what it truly takes to build and sustain a career in tech. Let's get into it.
Cyber Tech Podcast, inside the minds of everyday IT and cyber pros. And this is episode number 32. But before we get into episode number 32, if this is your first time listening to the Cyber Tech Podcast, be sure to subscribe to the AspireByte YouTube channel, where we share full podcast episodes, clips, and tech-focused content. And while you're there, like and share the videos to help spread the word. You can also listen to every episode of the Cyber Tech Podcast on Spotify. If you've already joined the show, give us a 5-star rating, drop a quick comment, and share with others. It helps reach more people, keeps the mission going. Thank you for everyone that's already done that. Want to explore more? Visit the AspireByte Hub at aspirebyte.car.co. That's CARD.co. It's your all-in-one starting point for free resources, podcast links, and merch. Speaking of merch, check out the AspireByte merch shop at aspirebyte.myspreadshop.com to rep the mission wherever you go. Let's get into episode number 32. This is going to be a really good episode. This individual I saw 3 years ago at CactusCon. CactusCon is essentially a cyber infosec conference that's every year in Mesa, Arizona in February. It had to do with voter registration. That was kind of with friends that work for kind of local governments here in Yuma that went over there. And I just kind of sat in, just hang out too as well. But this individual, he really caught my attention. You know, the years of experience that he talked about and really explained it really clearly for me. And I was like, oh, okay, because coming into InfoSec, you know, I'm still learning and stuff and whatnot. But that really caught my attention really quick here. And always want to get him on this podcast. And this is no other than Lester Godsey. He is the CISO of Arizona State University and advisor to Civil South. How's it going, Lester?
Good. How are you doing, Mike?
Good. I like I said before, Lester, before the podcast recording, your talk again. I was not in a role that had to do with voter registration, but your experience and specifically GRC, which is kind of a seat I'm in right now with my current company, really caught my attention. The way you explain things and very clearly, it caught my attention, and so I always wanted to get on here because I have a lot of folks that are trying to break into the field in InfoSec, specifically GRC. I'm really grateful, and I know you're a busy person out there in Maricopa County, so appreciate the time to get on here.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think part of it might be due to the fact that my initial training had nothing to do with technology. So my undergrad degree is in music, so
Awesome.
I was going to be a teacher. So maybe some of that teaching's coming into play. So,
Lester, for those that might not know your background and your story, kind of explain a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got into cyber.
I've been in IT for over 30 years. And so for those of the listeners that are my age, they know that cyber wasn't really a thing. So it wasn't a discipline back then. You couldn't major in it. The role of CISO was virtually unheard of at that time. It was around, but it was far and few between. And so really my journey occurred more along the lines of just traditional IT work. So I started my IT career at ASU actually as a student worker. I was wrapping up my music degree actually, and I got a job as a level 1 help desk person doing primarily VAX, VMS, and all the different flavors of Unix. And eventually transitioned from student worker to staff at ASU. So I worked at ASU from 94 and 2003. So in 2003, I left. That was about a year or so that President Crow came in as president of Arizona State University. And then I spent the next 21 years, somewhere in that ballpark, in local government. So I ran IT for the town of Queen Creek. I was their first full-time hire. That was back when, for those of you that are in the area, Queen Creek's population was 2,500. There was no stoplights. I was there when they put the first stoplight in, that sort of thing. And so I was there for 7.5 years. Then I was at City of Mesa for 9.5 years. The last 4 or 5 as their CISO. And then I was at Maricopa County, that's where we met, or you heard me speaking at CactusCon. You heard me speaking in my capacity as CISO at Maricopa County. So I was there from 2019 to the end of 24. So worked with that organization during the 2020 and the 2024 presidential elections, which arguably were the most contentious elections in modern history in this country.
Mm.
And then I was supposed to retire from the state retirement system, and then ASU made the offer. And so now I find myself back here as Arizona State University CISO. So during that
Awesome.
time, my undergrad's in music. I got my master's in technology. I've also taught on and off again at the collegiate level for over 15 years. And then most recently became a part-time advisor to CivilSoft, which is, I like to describe them as GRC adjacent. So yeah, so that's
Awesome.
kind of me in a nutshell.
That's awesome. It's interesting, right? Like it's, you come full circle, Lester, starting your career, your IT tech career at ASU and coming back. How to kind of touch on that? How is that coming back as a CISO now with your role at ASU and kind of looking back at your career and, you're back at where you started. How does that feel for you?
Probably the first word that comes to mind is surreal, honestly.
That's awesome.
And I've been asked by multiple people, and my experience between 94 and 2003 versus now, ASU has undergone such a transformation.
Mm.
Literally nothing is recognizable other than Old Main, if you know, you know. And the IP addresses for the domain name servers are the same. Other than that, everything else at ASU is completely different. And so it's been a trip. And so it's also been one of personal reflection in that when I started, literally, I didn't know what I didn't know. I was learning VI editor on, in a Unix environment,
Nice.
trying to figure out all this technology stuff. And now I'm coming back in a role where I'm responsible for guiding and protecting the organization from all things cyber. And so it's made me self-reflect on my own personal journey. So, and I do feel very fortunate to be in the role and to have the experience that I have gained over these last 30 years.
Lester, you mentioned you started back in the 90s. Let's talk about a little bit. Back in the 90s, what did IT even look like compared to today?
So when I started, the internet was a thing, but we were doing, to give some context, there wasn't really automation, not the way that we see it. There was no commercially viable sort of virtualization technology. Cloud computing wasn't a thing. So literally, I was doing HTML coding by hand.
Wow.
Using VI Editor for those of you that actually know what the heck that is. Not Vim, but VI, the predecessor to that, for non-graphical browsers. So, so the technology was completely different, and obviously the biggest change these days is AI along those lines. But interestingly enough, a lot of those concepts from technology back in the 90s still are relevant today. It's a different coat of paint with a different stack on top of it, but a lot of the fundamentals still exist. And so it's been an interesting journey. I will say the way that modern technology practitioners operate today are significantly different than the way that me and others did it, whether it's system administration, desktop support, networking, application development, et cetera, et cetera.
Growing up, I grew up with kind of my dad as well at Arizona Western College, and seeing folks using these old Mac computers and old PCs. It's I remember helping my dad install basic Photoshop. I think it was Photoshop version 1 on like 12 diskettes or something like that and whatnot.
Mhm.
And such a different time. The environments that you worked in, Lester, you worked in you have worked in education and also local government. When it comes to like IT support and cyber, what's the big differences between the two? Obviously, like both of those type of environments always hit on a daily basis, but what's kind of the insights you could give as far as like educational environment and kind of local government environment when it comes to IT cyber?
A lot of it has to do, the missions are different. And so, and as a result, from a cybersecurity perspective, the focus winds up being different. And so that's not to suggest that one organization or one vertical is superior or better than the other. It's just a matter of focus. And so hopefully your listeners take away that what we do as cybersecurity professionals is inextricably linked to that of the organization. So, for example, when I was at Maricopa County, the role that cybersecurity played was very different, I would say, arguably, even compared to other local government agencies. And the biggest reason why was due to the presidential election. So, to give a tangible example, we were dealing with so many threats, whether it was nation state based, hacking groups to hacktivists to insider threats and threats of physical harm against our elected officials as well as employees, that we had to update our incident response playbooks to reflect that reality, right? And so we put a premium on reputational risk and mitigation of those type of risks, right? Versus here at Arizona State University, not to suggest that ASU doesn't care about reputational risk, but the mission's different. And so we're a research one institution. There's a lot more focus on intellectual property, if you will. Mike, you being a GRC centric type of person, I can tell you all the compliance requirements, regulatory, and legal requirements that Maricopa County had, we have here at ASU, and we have more on top of that because of the nature of what we are as an organization. So in a digit, we still have to deal with CJIS here, right? Criminal Justice Information, because ASU has a police department. But then we have FERPA, student data. We also have GLBA, because ASU is international. We have to deal with GDPR. We also have new compliance requirements coming forth by the current, executive administration here at the federal level. And so compliance is a lot more challenging, I would say, here at ASU as opposed to other roles that I've had, that sort of thing. So really the organization and the mission of the organization dictates what the challenges and where the priorities are for cybersecurity.
I think that's a good stark contrast between the two, and knowing what environment you're in. And just to touch a little bit of GRC, Lester, I had folks that messaged me before our interview, specifically for you, Lester. What's kind of for those that students looking from the outside into the field, and then also maybe those professionals that maybe work in support. Like, I came from a support side and IT support. So what's kind of a practical guide, or you will, or steps someone could take, whether career changers, students, or pros, that can kind of pivot into kind of compliance and GRC type infosec role?
Yeah, so that actually is a very tough question. And the reason why, I was talking to somebody recently about how, in my experience, as a hiring manager, the most difficult positions in information security, I believe, to hire, other than CISO, which is a different problem unto itself. But other than that kind of role, I think GRC roles are the hardest to hire. And the reason why I say that is not to diminish the other disciplines typically found in information security. Good GRC people are kind of miniature unicorns in that they understand the technology enough where they understand the technical controls, right? But then they also have to understand the business, whether it's, because anything could be a control, right? So like a business process could be a control. So understanding what the business does, what the purpose behind it is, and why they care about whatever compliance or regulatory requirement that they have to adhere to, if you will. And so they have to have a good understanding of technology and a good understanding of business. And then on top of that, they have to be ideally good at communication. So it's kind of like the old Office Space movie. I take the requirements from the engineers, et cetera, et cetera. I'm good with people. Yeah. So good GRC people can do all that, right? And so whereas, again, not to take anything away from a SOC analyst or a security engineer or architect, those roles oftentimes tend to be more focused on the technology itself. They tend to be less customer facing. And so you can, to a certain degree, get away with being more technically minded as opposed to having to have a balanced approach to how you deliver your services. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's hard to be a good GRC person. And so, but by extension, I would suggest that it's also hard to get in as a GRC person, especially if you're brand new, right? Because it's already challenging enough these days to find information security positions, because we tend to look for entry level positions, except the job description and requirements aren't entry level, right? And so that, coupled with the fact that in addition to we wanting, somebody who understands the technology, but that also speaks business and has good verbal and written communication skills, that's a lot to ask for. So I would suggest for people trying to break in, whether they're coming straight from college or they're trying to pivot like you and I did, spend time understanding what the business is that you're looking at. So like if you are lucky enough to get an interview, understand what the business is. Use ChatGPT to extrapolate what maybe the primary concerns or motivations or priorities are for the business itself, right? And where, especially in a GRC capacity, what kind of business do they do? Who do they do business with? You can infer a lot with regards to, do they need to be worried about Sarbanes-Oxley or GDPR, or are they actively doing business in India? If they're doing business in India, India passed, some laws a couple of years ago around data privacy. And so at least demonstrating an awareness of that and that you did your homework and due diligence would go a long way. But then moving forward is working on, and especially if you're coming out of college, trying to find internships or even volunteer opportunities where you can work with a seasoned person to get that exposure and learn how to think along those lines, and also think in practical terms, I think would go a long way to help people break into or transition into a GRC role.
That's so well put, Lester. You mentioned about GRC folks being unicorns, and we are. It's interesting, right? Like I love documentation. I love documentation. Some folks don't. Some folks hate it. I've been on IT teams where, Mike, can you document this process I just did? Because I don't feel like even document anything. And so what helps me is coming from having that law enforcement experience, and documentation is 90% of our job in any law enforcement capacity. And so bringing that into IT, now into InfoSec, that's helped me a lot. But you're right, Lester. It's compliance in I think the past 2 years, compliance has been such a big push, and all these laws and keeping up with this stuff. I have an analogy I use here down in Yuma. Here I call it the craft. So for those folks that are trying to get into, like I did, right? I got into, I only have a few years in GRC, but I marinated as going to CactusCon, listening to folks podcasts, networking online. That's trying to get absorption on what it looks like. And that information you gave right there, Lester, such a weight in gold for those that trying to maybe even pivot into IT to InfoSec, or even trying to get in there to see where can I go. Because it's Lester, you get into IT and InfoSec and cyber, you're like, well, it's a big huge world, where do I go to? What's the steps to take? And I think the kind of clear pathing advice to give, it's going to be way more its weight in gold later on, for sure. How do you build a security culture across such a large organization? For example, you worked in different local governments, you have experience in education, but what is a good culture as far as cyber looks like?
When I'm trying to, in essence, create a culture that embraces security, there's a couple key tenets that I tend to come to mind. Number one, you can't really effectively create or change a culture if it's rammed down your throat and you have to do it, right? And so part of my objective with any organization is to help educate the organization in a way where they understand the business value of cybersecurity. And so the very first thing that needs to occur, at least my playbook, is to get the organization to realize, at least when I'm around, that cybersecurity is not a department whose first knee-jerk reaction is going to be to say no, right? Because if that's your one dance move, right, it's going to get really boring really quick. And so organizations who are constantly told no by somebody, just the natural state of being is going to be such that they're going to look at trying to find ways around you, right? And so,
Mm.
so cybersecurity programs need to get out of the habit of saying no, right? And then number two, from a cultural perspective, there needs to be some sort of inclusion that is felt across the organization. So governance is super, super critical
Mm.
for any sort of conversation around security culture. And so, what do I mean in the context of governance? I mean doing things like being transparent about what it is that you're trying to do and why you're doing it, more importantly, right? You're not trying to make people's lives more difficult, but rather you're trying to enable the organization, right? Our position here at ASU, for example, as well as Maricopa County, City of Mesa, et cetera, has always been we're here to enable the organization. And the way we do that is through being transparent and communicative. We solicit feedback and outreach from the business units within the organization. I won't mention what department it was at Maricopa County, but I had a very pointed conversation with a departmental CIO who'd accused us of being too prescriptive and too I guess less flexible about technology and tools and things of that sort. And so my response to this individual was, hey, we invited you and every other department in the organization to participate in our PLCs of technology. We have a program strategy and roadmap that we share with everybody and we update it twice a year. And you guys have gotten copies of it. We have dashboards that show what data that we're consuming from your log data. So you know exactly what we're doing and how we're leveraging your data. So
Mm.
what part of this is overly prescriptive, and what part of this is not collaborative, right? And that was the end of the conversation.
Mm.
But really, the objective here is to be able to speak in a language that the business understands and
Mm.
appreciate. And so from from my point of view, the Rosetta Stone, if you will, is not technology jargon, but risk. And so
Mm.
our job, so one of the things we did here at ASU just recently is we enacted departmental cyber risk reports that we're issuing twice a year to individual departments. So like over 30 some departments here at ASU, their leadership have received this, and not for purposes of being punitive or to slap hands or things of that sort, but rather, hey, based off of our assessment of the environment, here's where we believe the greatest risk to your department lies. And
Mm.
so the purpose behind that is to point that out so then we can have a conversation and say, what can we collaborate on to reduce that risk to a level that's acceptable,
Mm.
not only to you, but to the enterprise as a whole, right? And so we have found success here at ASU, as well as in my previous roles, of taking a similar approach on being collaborative and actually being looked at as business partners because they trust us. Well, why do they trust us? Because we're transparent, we're honest, we're communicative, and we show our homework, right? Along those lines. And they know that we're doing this for the greater good and their own good along those lines. So those are some of the things that I look at in terms of trying to create a culture that embraces cybersecurity as opposed to pushes us away.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Roadmap, if you will, Lester, that you do. And you mentioned as being the Rosetta Stone. Most folks, especially coming from IT or even other disciplines, it's hard to be proactive, and we're more sometimes firefighters and being reactive to things.
Mhm.
And it's me personally, getting to the seat that I'm in right now with my company I'm in right now, changing that. I've always had a for those that listen that have some kind of a proactive mindset first. I've always had a proactive mindset, just coming from law enforcement, seeing that risks in that environment, which is totally different, And so coming to IT and then infosec, it's being proactive really helps because it scales down the tick noise on the IT side. They don't have to worry about different alerts that might be popping up, whatever the environment might be looking like and whatnot. And your approach, given data, showing proof, being collaborative. How important is that, Lester? Whether folks, specifically talking about folks already in the industry that listen to this podcast, that or maybe in IT, cyber, or infosec, how important it is to have that collaborative mindset, whether you're in the GRC team, maybe the blue red team, maybe the networking engineers or projects team support. Why is it so important for us to work together?
So a couple of reasons come to mind. One is human nature. So
Mm,
if I'm being, from my perspective, it's human nature where if you have an inherently adversarial relationship with another person, you're only going to get the bare minimum out of that relationship, right? And so if we don't have a collaborative relationship with other areas within the enterprise, we're only going to get the bare minimum, whether that's insight or support, right? And so by having a collaborative relationship, that's when you are more likely or inclined to have the network people say, "Oh, hey, by the way, we haven't looked at firewall rules in
mm,
over 2 years, right? Hey, that's good information to have there. Maybe we can collaborate and create a process, and we can automate that and tie that into our
mm,
ITSM, so that way annual tickets are, biannual tickets are created that assign to the appropriate person to review firewall rules, for example.
mm,
So if you have an adversarial relationship, you're never going to get to that level of insight. You're going to get the bare minimum, and that's not really security, right?
mm,
And then related to that is also being realistic about who the originator of most cybersecurity risk is. And
mm,
so this becomes more of a conversation around org structure and things of that sort. But every single organization I've ever worked for, yes, will the business create their own risk from a cybersecurity nature? Of course they will, especially when it comes to data use, data security, things of that sort. But like if we're talking about things like vulnerability management or configurations, things of that sort, from a technical controls or technology point of view, enterprise IT by and large is the one that creates the most risk to any organization, right? In order to address that, especially if security happens to report into the same org structure as the rest of IT, then it's critical to have, a collaborative relationship with your network team, with your data team, with your application development, desktop support, et cetera, teams, right? Because more often than not, you're not going to have the resources to remediate those findings to begin with. So you're better off being in a collaborative relationship where they have trust that you're not going to throw them under the bus
yeah.
because you found a vulnerability that they may have inadvertently created, right? And so for a variety of different reasons, it's just you're better off and you're going to have a if you let's put it this way, if your end objective is to actually effectuate a reduction of cyber risk within the organization, it behooves everybody to have a more collaborative relationship as opposed
Mm.
to adversarial.
I like that. It's a good reminder for us in the field to even those looking inside, trying to get into the field to have that collaborative mindset and always be ready to help out, support GRC team projects, even those that trying to maybe pivot into cyber or maybe infosec and or maybe project management. That's a good way to have the collaborative mindset. And they, like you mentioned, Lester, having that working with a network team or something like that, whatever team it may be, you could get in there like, hey, well, Mike Lester helped us out. Maybe they want to join the project team, or maybe they want to come in GRC. And let me see if they have any interest, and that kind of helps them out too.
It's funny you mentioned that, Mike. So now that I'm thinking about your question, which was a really good one, probably one of the best partnerships and one that I tend to focus on, regardless of the organization I'm in, is with internal audit. And
Mm,
so, internal audit and enterprise risk management, those are key relationships, regardless of what level you sit in the organization, right?
yeah.
Those are key relationships to build within any organization. So, I would encourage your listeners to, regardless of, again, they don't have to be in the GRC necessarily either. They could be a SOC analyst, they could be a security engineer. Get to know those people.
That's so important. And Lester, I want to touch on a little bit. I saw that. Let me see if I can bring up the article here on my side. But I saw, I think in early January, you're one of the top. Here we go. You were one of the top 200 CISOs or so. CISOs Connect
Oh, yeah.
in early 2026, earlier this year, a couple months ago or so. It says they even highlighted their technology LinkedIn page, celebrating you as a Chief Information Security Officer for being recognized among top CISOs early this year. How does that accomplishment feel, Lester?
It's always nice to be recognized for your work. Being in the CISO role is kind of a double-edged sword, right? And so
Mm.
when things go sideways and go south, you're the person that is ultimately responsible, right? And
Yeah.
so that tends to be a very solitary sort of thing. But that's the job, right? So the job in being a CISO is to take the hits when it's necessary, right? But then occasions like the one you just described and being recognized for that
Mm.
at the same time, we don't operate in vacuums, right? And so
True.
my ability to get that level of recognition is directly tied to my team. They're the ones, frankly, did all the heavy lifting and the hard work
Mm.
along those lines. And so I'm very fortunate. And in all three of my jobs, ASU, Maricopa County, and City of Mesa, I had very good teams along those lines. And so I get to, while I get the recognition, it really belongs to the team as a whole. And so, but it is nice uh, because honestly, especially in cybersecurity, as you know, Mike, more often than not, good news is typically followed by silence and then not an award, right?
True.
The only time people really want to talk to us is when things have gone sideways.
Reminiscent on different teams in my past, and maybe those folks listen to this podcast, if you guys remember the teams that you're on, they're just like, because we've been on teams that maybe could be better as far as
Sure.
collaboration and stuff like that. It could always be better. I remember some teams I'm on, and I'm like, I want to be the first one there, and I want to be the last one there, and just going through the grind with that team, whether it's working with the cyber team or GRC team, auditing, whatever it may be, just being there. I think trying to get into if you're listening to this podcast right now, you're trying to get into IT. Once you get in here, there's nothing being like on a good team. Like, you love the people you're working with. Nothing's perfect, but like you love the grind, you love the troubleshooting and the camaraderie, if you will. A lot of people don't talk about that. Working in whether IT, cyber, infosec, the camaraderie, I think it's really, really important. The culture is really important, and you touched on the Lester about collaboration. When you have that, and people are just having a good time and just you get to know people's demeanor. It just there's nothing like it. It's just like a good, well run, oiled NBA team, winning championships, if you will, knocking out tickets, projects left and right. You're just like, wow, there's nothing like that feeling. It's so awesome to have that type of feeling, especially with the teamwork. If you could have one cybersecurity superpower, what would it be? Mind reading developers, instantly patching systems, or eliminating phishing forever, or whatever you come up with.
Well, since you gave me that option, that's a no-brainer, eliminating phishing forever. So, especially in this day and age, the biggest threat vector is still email, right? So, short of somebody being able to legitimately get rid of email as a platform, that would be awesome. Um, but phishing still, by and large, is the biggest issue and is still the biggest initial threat vector, if you will, facing any enterprise today. So if we could get rid of phishing emails altogether, 100%, that would make everybody's cybersecurity
Oh,
program
man.
that much better and allow us to focus on adversarial slash focused attacks, if you will. So that would be fantastic. So, Mike, anything you could do along those lines would be greatly appreciated.
Oh man, no, I can imagine just waking up one day and getting alerts on your phone. We don't have to worry about phishing emails anymore. Cool, nice. That's one less thing. No, Lester, I had such a great time talking to you and getting to know you more. And also, you dropped a lot of gold nuggets, especially particularly for me, but also for listeners that are listening to this podcast to figure out how to get into IT, cyber, infosec, what it takes for working those type of particular environments. Working in local government, education space. And Lester, for those that may want to get hold of you or even maybe check out the advisor role you're in with CivilSoft, how can they check that information out?
Yeah, probably the best way to do that is to hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm fairly active along those lines. And so, one thing, especially for folks like I know the gentleman who reached out to you about the question,
Okay.
I'm breaking into GRC. And so I've met him a couple other instances. And so one thing I would encourage your listeners to do is be more participatory in the industry and in groups, right? So so specific to me, hit me up on LinkedIn. So just do a search for Lester Godsey. There's not a whole lot of Lesters out there. And so that's the best way to get a hold of me. But I would encourage people to attend local meetings and conferences, right? So whether it's the local ISA chapters, my buddy, I'll just, if you don't mind me name dropping, his name is
Sure.
Eddie Clark. He's ran for years now a meetup group for East Valley
Nice.
Security Meetup Group, and so I try to attend those once a month as well, first Thursday of every month. So check that out, or just some of the local conferences. So, for example, on Thursday is the Elevate IT conference. I'll be speaking on a panel at that, and so I would encourage people trying to break in to try to be more out there in the network and do more networking. So I forgot to mention, you mentioned CivicSoft. And so for those of you who are interested in looking at a more realistic way to address GRC deficiencies, I would argue, take a look at the product that I advise for. It's called Cibility, but the website's cibylsoft.com, SIBYLSOFT.com.
Thanks for getting on. I appreciate your time getting on the podcast. I know folks are gonna learn a lot from this podcast, and you gotta keep on pushing forward and whatnot. And I appreciate that.
I appreciate you and your podcast and what you're doing for the community and the practice. So
thanks, appreciate that. You listen to Lester Godsey, episode number 32, CISO of Arizona State University, advisor to CivicSoft. See you guys.